Welcome to the Moynihan Report. I'm your host, Michael Moynihan, not in Brooklyn today, live from the compound in East Egg. And, I get excited for every show. I always get engaged and learn something. We have weird people on from all over the political map and musicians and filmmakers and the rest of it. But this one today, I am especially excited about. And why? I'll tell you this. I'll just put it this way. I was thinking of doing this like monologue at the top about Jeffrey Epstein, because that's all anyone seems to be talking about. The thing will not die. He's the undead man who absolutely committed suicide, by the way. He had a lot of reason to. And then I realized I shouldn't do that at the top. And the reason I shouldn't do that is because I steal everything that I would say from Michael Tracey. Because Michael Tracey,
shocking admission.
Yeah, it's a shocking admission. I am the Jonah Lehrer of this show.
That's a throwback.
Yeah,
I forgot about that one.
And I'm the one that wrote about him. So,
that's right. Slate, right?
Nobody remembers that. It's a forgotten about thing. I'm trying to get
Slate,
it into the Epstein conspiracy. But Michael Tracey, journalist, Substacker, podcaster, all that stuff you would expect. But somebody who also, I can swear on my own show, right? He doesn't give a fuck, which is what I appreciate about Michael Tracey, is that a lot of people, when you talk about Epstein and you don't say the thing, which is Mossad agent who was murdered by Ehud Barak or whatever the latest theory is, you get called all sorts of names online, including pedophile, which seems to be the number one name that Michael is called when I check in. But Michael Tracey, thanks for being here, because we need to clarify some stuff for a lot of people, including friends of mine, smart people who seem to not really understand this story. So I'm going to ask you a question up top. And that question is, what do we know for sure about Jeffrey Epstein and his crimes? I mean, was he a trafficker? Was he a messiah? Or was he a guy that was a perv and, slept with underage girls and that's it?
Well, first off, I will heartily agree that there is much clarification, quote unquote, that is definitely needed around this story.
Yeah.
I'm increasingly staggered. The more I look into it, the more that the public narrative just unravels upon the most basic scrutiny. And it's not that I wanted to get so hyper invested in the story particularly. I had followed it intermittently over the years and grown increasingly skeptical whenever I would delve into some recent developments, whether it was unsealed court filings or other matters that might arise. But since the summer of Epstein of 2025, which is how it will go down, has been inaugurated, I have gotten fully engrossed, and I'm just shocked. I mean, I'll answer your question, but just by way of context, I'm constantly being asked to talk about this every single day. So it's not as though I can even avoid it anymore if I wanted, even if I wanted to. I was interviewed by Turkish journalists who were in the United States yesterday, and we're doing a documentary, and they asked me to talk for like 2 hours about Epstein. So I guess I'll just abide. Anyway, so what do we know that he did? Well, we know he pleaded guilty in Florida in 2008 to state level charges. One of the charges that was added at the insistence of federal prosecutors, Alex Acosta, who was the U.S. attorney in South Florida, interceded into then ongoing Palm Beach criminal investigation against Epstein, because some of the Palm Beach cops essentially were disenchanted with how the local prosecutor was handling the case. So they complained to the feds. And this has become another bone of contention in terms of what people infer went on during the negotiation and finalization of that non-prosecution agreement by federal prosecutors. But it ended up with Epstein pleading guilty to 2 counts, essentially. And one of them, which subsequently did require him to register as a sex offender in most states, not all states, it turned out. For example, he inquired with New Mexico and asked if he was required, because he had a ranch there, and asked if he was required to register as a sex offender and therefore report all his movements to the local authorities in New Mexico. And because the minor, whom he acknowledged by pleading guilty, he quote unquote procured for prostitution, was 17, at the time of the alleged acts. He was not required to register in New Mexico, but he was required to register in other places, particularly Florida and others. I think New Mexico.
So we know that from the guilty plea, and he's sentenced to 19 months. He serves 13, 18 months, serves 13, but serves is a verb that should be interrogated a little bit because he got to basically go home and do his office job, right? I mean, so he slept there, and according to a lot of the journalism I read, and if I'm wrong about this, do clarify it, that he had a pretty easy go of it for those 13 months.
Well, yeah, because one of the provisions of the non-prosecution agreement was that Epstein would be required to arrange for the conditions of his confinement with the Palm Beach County authority, because he was in a Palm Beach County detention facility, which is distinct from the Palm Beach city or municipal authorities. Like, there's a lot of sometimes confusion around that issue. It doesn't matter all that much, but yes, ultimately he was permitted by the Palm Beach County detention authorities, or the Palm Beach County jail authorities or prison authorities, to have a relatively lenient term of incarceration, where he applied for work release. He was granted work release. The prison administrators insist that he was deemed eligible for work release by adjudicative process that any other inmate would have been subject to. People don't really believe that, because Epstein was in fact incredibly wealthy, so he could use his high-powered attorneys,
yes,
to represent him even in this post-conviction phase having to do with his confinement,
which included Alan Dershowitz and Kenneth Starr, right?
That's right.
So I mean, it's not an unknown legal team of
Roy Black was one of the most prominent criminal defense attorneys in the Miami area. He was also on the team. Jay Lefkowitz
was there too.
Yes. So nobody's denying, or I've never denied, that of course he was incredibly unusual in the sense that he was incredibly well resourced, and it's incredibly unusual for somebody who's so wealthy to have been charged with these sorts of sex crimes that then are claimed to have some kind of federal nexus.
Well, it's an interesting thing to me, because I mean, we understand just in the common parlance and in movies and in television shows that rich people get away with things, right? That's just presumed, that there's a different set of rules for them because they can afford high-powered attorneys. But in this case, it is indicative of a widespread conspiracy. It was the one time I've seen people not acknowledge that because he was so rich, and because they chose lawyers who had friends that were new people that the prosecutors had worked with at certain law firms, et cetera, that it was just a skilled defense. And that is usually something that people complain about, that the rich have different resources from the poor. But in this case, that goes out the window, and that is the germ of the conspiracy. That's where it begins with a lot of the stuff that I hear, is that he's taken care of by Alex Acosta and the government. Alex Acosta goes on to be Donald Trump's labor secretary in his first term. That is kind of where it starts, right? I mean, where people see the conspiracy starting.
Well, it's a double-edged sword with people who are rich and powerful, because of course, if you're rich, and or famous, or let's just say rich, you can afford to hire legal representation that people of more modest means are not going to be able to afford. But you also are probably more susceptible to frivolous litigation from people who want to secure some percentage of your wealth that if you were of lesser means, you would not be subject to, because there would be no reason for the frivolous lawsuits to be filed. And I'm not saying that every possible lawsuit that could have been filed against Epstein was necessarily frivolous, but just in terms of the broad discrepancy between the rich and the non-rich, I think it can be a double-edged sword. I also should note that the 17-year-old who it appears Epstein pleaded guilty to procuring for prostitution. And I say it appears because when he actually entered his guilty plea in Palm Beach in June of 2008, it wasn't 100% clear which purported victim he was attesting to have victimized by procuring that victim for prostitution. meaning underage victim. It wasn't clear what precise underage victim he was attesting to, but I think it seems reasonable to infer that because there was one young woman, who was by then over the age of 18, so of legal age, but at the time that she said that she did have sexual intercourse with Epstein, meaning full sex, it was, she said, a day before her 18th birthday when she was 17, technically, and that it was actually consensual. Now, I know people will go crazy if I simply recite that fact, that the 17-year-old girl who was days away from her 18th birthday told the grand jury that, or told investigators that this was a consensual act. And you can go on the Palm Beach website where there were FOIA requests made, and they ended up doing a big document dump, a bunch of these videos. She's on video saying that this sexual act was consensual or not coerced of her. I know people go crazy when you mention that, but it's simply true that that video is available for anybody to go watch if they really wanted to. So, and you know, if you say that, it automatically means that you're suspicious, or maybe you're trying to do some on some sinister mission to normalize sex relations between adults in their 50s and 17-year-olds. I'm not, people. Whoever is watching out there, that's not what my intent is at all. If I could imagine most fathers who are sane, who have teenage daughters who are somewhere between let's say 16 and 19, or whatever age range we want to say, whether technically above the legal age of consent or not. I can imagine those fathers strongly counseling those daughters to not get involved in any situation where they might be requested to provide sexualized massages, whatever degree of sexualization we're talking about, to a man in his 50s, because even if those daughters might perceive it contemporaneously to be something that is worthwhile because they could get $200 in cash, which is what Epstein did furnish a lot of these teenage girls, it still is liable to produce a gigantic mess that you probably don't want to be embroiled in for many years, as the Epstein girls are in the Palm Beach area ended up being. So
let me ask you this, Michael, and you know, I don't want to go down the road which I've seen on Twitter of people debating whether or not Jeffrey Epstein is a pedophile, definitionally a pedophile. I don't really care about those debates, but one of the things that I notice in all of the conversation about Epstein is the word trafficking. And the word trafficking, which has a pretty elastic definition, and old pal Elizabeth Nolan Brown over at Reason has written great stuff about this over the years, and how the government hits people with trafficking charges that wouldn't traditionally seem like trafficking to most people. You know, Ghislaine Maxwell is in prison and was found guilty of trafficking between herself and Jeffrey Epstein, as far as I can tell. What is the truth of the matter about the trafficking allegations, and who made those allegations? Because am I wrong in thinking that it came from one person and one person only?
Right. So actually, Elizabeth Nolan Brown was very influential on me when I first began reading about this whole subject of child sex trafficking or human trafficking, probably over a decade ago at this point. So yes, people should go look at her writings from, I don't know, the late 2010s or so, on the issue of trafficking and how it's an incredibly amorphous concept. Prosecutors absolutely love it. They love when Congress passes new statutes endowing prosecutors to more aggressively go after so-called perpetrators of trafficking, because the contours of what constitutes quote unquote trafficking are ever expansive. Because what is trafficking fundamentally? I mean, there are many definitions one can find, and you can find how it tends to be defined in the federal code. But really, at bottom, it tends to mean just facilitating or somehow assisting in the ability of some other individual to move from one place to another. Mm-hmm. So that's trafficking. It does seem as though that there's been a huge cultural, political, and legal shift over only just the past maybe 2 decades, where activity or conduct that would have been commonly understood to constitute prostitution in, say, the 2000s now gets automatically grouped under the banner of quote unquote trafficking in the 2020s. And even if you look at some of the early litigation that was filed in relation to Epstein, some of the purported victims, or rather the attorneys working on behalf of the purported victims, characterize the conduct that they were party to as, in part, prostitution. So this would have been like maybe 2009. And today, nobody in their right mind, meaning other than me, I guess, or perhaps you or a handful of others, although I don't even think there would even be a handful. Nobody in their right mind would use the word prostitution to describe anything that occurred to any quote unquote Epstein victim, right? And I think that's just reminiscent of this under-examined, under-acknowledged, underappreciated cultural, political, and legal shift that just kind of happened without much public debate or scrutiny, because who wants to be scrutinizing the tools available to prosecutors to go after, quote, traffickers?
Yeah, I mean,
in terms of Maxwell,
yeah,
she was, people don't understand this. Like, you still hear people asking as a rhetorical question, if there are no other perpetrators, meaning if there's nobody that the government is concealing that was on some quote unquote client list, then how is it that Ghislaine Maxwell is in prison? Now, when people ask that question, they reveal that they don't know the slightest damn thing about Ghislaine Maxwell's actual trial. You can go read all the transcripts from the trial. I have, for better or worse, in terms of my sanity, but I have read all the transcripts of that trial. There's a million other proceedings and documentations related to those proceedings that one can review if they really wanted to. And you don't even have to read every last sentence of every transcript to understand that what Maxwell was convicted of doing was participating in a, quote, sex trafficking conspiracy that consisted of a grand total of 2 people per the government. And according to the victims whom the government decided that they would call to testify at trial against Maxwell, the supposed sex trafficking conspiracy to which Maxwell was found guilty for participating in consisted of a grand total of 2 people, herself and Epstein. So if anybody asks that rhetorical question as though they're trying to express their incredulity that there really couldn't be a quote unquote client list that the government continues to cover up under the second Trump administration, then they just show that they are just provably ignorant about the basic facts of the Maxwell trial. And
I mean, and
that's
also
just one example of what
yeah.
people are sorely devoid of in terms of their basic knowledge around this issue.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that I find interesting is that, as far as I can tell, and I haven't followed this nearly as closely as you have, Michael, but this sense that comes with, I mean, it's impregnated in the idea of trafficking, is that there are famous people that are part of this trafficking conspiracy. There's an implication that Epstein got rich off of this, somehow became a billionaire by trafficking women to famous people, and that there's blackmail involved in this too. And those 3 things, just picked out of thin air on the top of my head, I became skeptical of this story and some of the narrative surrounding the story, because I went and looked for the prosecution presenting these arguments, and it seems like nobody really has, outside of people in the media who think it's probably a better and sexier story if Bill Clinton and Prince Andrew and, you know, maybe Kevin Spacey or something, Chris Tucker, are involved in some massive trafficking ring. The word ring is always dropped in there too. But as far as I can tell, and I think I'm right about this, that has never been alleged by the government, right? Or by prosecutors, either in 2019 or in 2008.
No, it's never been alleged in any kind of court proceeding that would be attendant to an adversarial process and in a criminal setting. There's been plenty of civil litigation that has at least invoked some of this stuff, but almost all of the civil litigation that did allege a widespread trafficking ring, or sometimes they'll call it an operation or a network, whatever synonym they can conjure up that has the most titillating and nefarious connotations. All of that, virtually all of that, stems from one person, Virginia Giuffre, who people don't want to hear it. People get offended when I say this. People think it's outrageous for her to even be discussed in these terms, but she was a proven serial fabulist. There's no other way to swing it.
And she was the one person that made the allegations
She
about
was the one
celebrities
who,
and
in December of 2014, her attorneys, Bradley Edwards and Paul Cassell, filed what was called a motion for rejoinder on her behalf because there was ongoing litigation around the Crime Victims' Rights Act, which is a statute that is dubious on civil libertarian grounds to begin with, because it has attempted, pursuant to that statute, there have been efforts to make it so that the burden is on the government increasingly to notify whom it designates as victims, even before perhaps anyone has been convicted or pleaded guilty to a crime that those victims have purportedly been victimized by. So that's what people are saying was wrongfully done by the feds in the original Florida prosecution, because there wasn't robust enough notification of purported victims prior to Epstein pleading guilty, which he eventually did in June of 2008. But the idea was that there should have been this whole universe of purported victims or government designated victims notified prior to his guilty plea, which came about as a result of the federal non-prosecution agreement. And Epstein, as I said before, pleaded to state level charges. But in terms of, yes, these sprawling child sex trafficking claims, which really do animate the core reason why people are so incensed about this issue, right? Their unswerving confidence that there must exist this multi-layered, multi-dimensional child sex trafficking or pedophilia network that was being orchestrated by Epstein, and in which he entrapped essentially this whole range of prominent individuals across an array of industries, whether it's business, academia, politics, etc. He entrapped all these prominent people in his web of child sex trafficking, perhaps surreptitiously filmed them in compromising sexual encounters, and then use that to blackmail them in conjunction with some intelligence agency, or maybe even a multitude of intelligence agencies. A lot of people say Israeli intelligence, but perhaps also the CIA, maybe even MI6. Who knows? There have even been claims that he was in cahoots with Russia. But it doesn't really have to add up to anything particularly coherent. People just assume that there was some intelligence dimension here that has been a central reason why the cover-up continues, and why now Trump and Kash Patel and Dan Bongino and Pam Bondi are now party to that alleged cover-up.
Yeah, I mean,
yes, this all stems from one person, essentially
yeah.
Virginia Giuffre, who's a proven fabulist.
Yeah,
and I know people will blanch when they hear me say that. Not Todd Blanche, the Attorney General. I'm saying the verb to blanch, which means to recoil in horror when I say that she was a proven fabulist. But we can go over chapter and verse the evidence that I think indisputably establishes that this person was a proven fabulist. The only other person who it can be claimed could have made a allegation along these lines around child sex trafficking or just sex trafficking is another proven fabulist, Sarah Ransom, who, all of the other things being equal, says herself that she was an adult woman in her 20s when she supposedly became enmeshed in Epstein's orbit. And she, in a deposition, acknowledged that prior to even becoming acquainted with Epstein, she was engaging in transactional sex activities with quote unquote gentlemen, she said, where she, through some undefined or unidentified agency, met up with a gentleman for quote dinner, and on some occasions she ended up having, she said, consensual sex with some of these wealthy older gentlemen who were paying for her time. And then she gets involved with Epstein, and years later everything gets repurposed, as she tells it, as trafficking that she was subjected to. And she attempted to get in touch with, and did get in touch with, Gouffre's attorneys, who at that point included David Boies, the high-powered attorney who famously represented Al Gore in Bush versus Gore in 2000, and other very high-profile matters he was a party to. And this woman, Sarah Ransom, swears an affidavit saying that she too was sex trafficked, for instance, to Alan Dershowitz, which is one of the people whom Gouffre had always claimed, starting with in that 2014 motion for joinder, that she had been sex trafficked to. According to Gouffre, at least six separate occasions that she subsequently described in graphic detail, or purported to describe in graphic detail. Sarah Ransom then attempted to interject into some ongoing litigation and provide an affidavit that she hoped would corroborate Gouffre. And it turned out Sarah Ransom, too, was a total hallucinatory fabulous. She admitted she made up that she had sex tapes of people, including Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, Prince Andrew, Richard Branson. She admitted in public that she made this up. And of course, Gouffre also had to admit in a settlement that she had falsely accused Alan Dershowitz, whose sex encounter she claims she had with him on at least 6 occasions she had previously described in lurid, graphic detail, as though she was just absolutely unimpeachably certain that they did in fact happen. And then, but finally, after almost a decade, she recanted those claims and effectively had to admit that they were false. But those two people, Gouffre, and then very tangentially, one of the other supposed victims who had attempted to provide her help in corroborating Gouffre, those are the only two who could be said to have spurred these whole elaborate child sex trafficking or pedophilia network claims that people just take for granted must be factually established as the thing that's fundamentally being covered up in this whole Epstein case. And it's just beyond ill-founded in terms of what people think the evidence must be to substantiate this.
Yeah, and then the number of people that have pretty serious credibility problems. I mean, one of the things that surprises me, I suppose it shouldn't surprise me, but people in the MAGA universe, the Bonginos and Kash Patel, before, when they were kind of making this stuff up before, and then everyone says, oh, look at, they're nervous, they're covering it up. It's like, no, they actually were finally telling the truth when they actually looked and said, oh, there's nothing here. But those guys in MAGA universe who would, bang the drum, because you reminded me of this by saying people have even connected Jeffrey Epstein to Russia, the Russiagate stuff, if you look back at it, when the sort of MSNBC crowd was going in hard on it, this stuff seemed plausible. It could be these connections. This guy is a bad guy. This guy was in Russia, blah, blah. It could be. This could be it. But that's exactly what happens in the Epstein stuff. Yeah, it could. I mean, you could be, having taping videotapes of Bill Clinton and blackmailing him. That sounds like it could be a thing because he's also involved in these sex things. It seems plausible, but there's actually no evidence at the end. And it astonishes me that people still repeat this stuff as if there is, and it takes a lot to kind of unwind that and tell people that there isn't. But let me ask you this question. This is something, less factual and something more, asking you to kind of ruminate on this. Why do you think it is that, particularly in conservative world now, that this idea that there's pedophile rings everywhere, and that's one of the bases of QAnon, et cetera, this seems to really animate a lot of people, that this sense that the world has at least partially controlled by satanic pedophile rings. It sounds like the satanic panic of the 80s all over again.
Clearly, there's something in the right-wing id, particularly as it manifests on the internet and social media, that needs a perpetual child sex trafficking ring to exist and to be covered up in order to fuel its engagement with political matters. I mean, I don't know how anybody could really deny that at this point. There's something very visceral and animalistic and primal about it. I think it interestingly gives people on the right, and I'm not trying to cast aspersions on everybody who could be said to be in some sense right wing. Not everybody believes this, but there's clearly a significant percentage of people who do, and they tend to be overrepresented online. it allows them to like morally preen as these virtuous defenders of the sanctity of children. And that goes back a long ways in terms of what animates the right wing psyche. So there's Maud Flanders on The Simpsons, who is depicted as like basically one of these moral majority people, essentially Anita Bryant.
Yeah, she's a Phyllis Schlafly of animation.
Yeah, Ned Flanders. Yeah, Phyllis Schlafly. I think she's probably modeled on Anita Bryant. I don't know if you know who that is, but
Florida former beauty queen. Yeah,
exactly. But Maud Flanders on The Simpsons says, "Won't someone please think of the children?" Yeah. And in the '90s, or whenever that episode of The Simpsons came out, I think it would have been in the '90s. Liberals would have laughed at that slogan because they understood it to basically be a smokescreen for the government to censor, for the government to stifle creative production or creative productivity on the grounds that some of the material that might be produced by artists or filmmakers or writers or whatever was going to spoil the innocence of our children and therefore had to be curtailed, or there had to be like parental restrictions on things. That was a big thing in the '90s. Bill Clinton signed off on a lot of it, like the V chip that got inserted into TVs, so kids couldn't watch certain programming at night or what have you. But I think this goes way back in terms of the right-wing psyche, this idea that there's this wellspring of innocence in our youth that we must protect. And look, people who I can almost anticipate the spurious charge that some in the audience might want to make against me. No, I'm not saying that bona fide children should not be protected from bona fide sexual predation. Of course, anybody who is sane agrees that true pedophilic predation on children ought to be discouraged. And if there's any inkling that it's actually happening, that intervention should be made to prevent it from happening. Okay, so we can all agree on that. It's just that in terms of like a moral panic or a moral hysteria that gets propagated, I think that there's a long-term genesis of it to why it now manifests on the right as being very tied in with this Epstein mania and previously QAnon. Now, Epstein has a more tangible or concrete factual predicate than QAnon ever did, which was basically just a genuine hallucination that like various, I think probably cynical people started pumping out on the right-wing fevered internet. But Epstein, in terms of how people conceptualize it now, does borrow thematically from QAnon in terms of this conviction that the world is fundamentally governed by the purported existence of these child sex trafficking rings, and also by the determination on the part of people in power to ensure that they're covered up and that the people will never know who exactly among their elites or among their masters are these depraved child sex traffickers.
Yeah, I will say too, in a sort of mild defense of the people that spout this stuff that drives me so crazy, is that much like the JFK assassination, and I'm one of the 7 people in America who understand that it was Lee Harvey Oswald who shot JFK, there are so many things that are curious, right? There's Oswald's getting killed by this rando Jack Ruby a couple of days later to shut him up. It makes a certain amount of sense. The Les Wexner stuff, and those people who don't know this, the man who started The Limited and ultimately was running Victoria's Secret, billionaire, and somehow Jeffrey Epstein gets power of attorney and is kind of thought to be the kind of sort of the text of his fortune. It all started with there's so many unanswered questions. Why is Leon Black getting all of this money for quote unquote tax advice? And there seems to be some, halfway reasonable answers to that, but only halfway. So I get where a lot of this stuff comes from because, it is a very, very curious thing. And the guy is very, very powerful. He's convicted of something. He pleads guilty to something. And yet after that, he's still hanging out with all sorts of very powerful people. And that is very curious to a lot of people, including myself.
I agree. I totally get why people are endlessly fascinated by this story. I now find it endlessly fascinating. I sort of did before, to the degree that I would every couple months maybe check in on whatever the new developments were.
Yeah.
But as I've been like fanatically, obsessively engrossed in it for the past 5 weeks or so, I find it more fascinating by the day, essentially. And yes, there are components here which, if you look at superficially, seem mysterious. There are some genuine mysteries, perhaps, as well. But in totality, I am emphatically in agreement with the people who would maintain that this is interesting, perhaps somewhat enigmatic, or totally enigmatic, and that's why that they want more information. I too want more information. But you mentioned Russiagate earlier.
Yeah,
it's interesting. There are some parallels here, okay, just in terms of how the public consumes or synthesizes information around both these stories. Radically different in other ways. I'm not trying to make a direct all-purpose parallel necessarily. But I remember, and maybe you recall to some extent, I was one of the very few people who's even media adjacent who was extremely skeptical and covered intensively Russiagate from a skeptical angle virtually from the outset.
Mhm.
So let's say July of 2016, basically around the time when Jeffrey Goldberg was one of the first people to be writing in the Atlantic saying or positing or basically theorizing that Trump could in some sense be compromised or in hoc to Putin. And then that spawned or contributed to spawning a lot of, I think, still very dubiously predicated investigative activity on the part of security state agencies. And then gradually the drumbeat grew, and we would get these little seemingly juicy or scintillating tidbits of information that seemed to suggest that something was deeply amiss with respect to Trump's relationship with Russia. DMs between like Donald Trump Jr. and the WikiLeaks account would be selectively leaked through Adam Schiff's House Intelligence investigation to select reporters, and it would dominate the day's news cycle. It would be that day's bombshell, right? Benjamin Wittes, who ran Lawfare, that website, would say boom, and then that would be his way to summon his followers to recognize that there was some bombshell boom that just landed, and everybody needed to fixate frenetically on this latest development. And one of the things that I would be told by embittered liberals and Democrats mostly at the time was that what I didn't understand was that, quote, where there's smoke, there's fire. Or that look at all these, quote unquote, connections between, quote unquote, Russian contacts and people in Trump's orbit or universe. Didn't I understand that this all must add up to something totally sensational and ruinous for Trump that would cause him to have to resign in disgrace and maybe abscond to Russia? That was basically what I was told at the time. And I'm told now some very similar things with respect to the Epstein story. Don't I understand that where there's smoke, there's fire? Sure, we don't have any rock solid proof of the supposed blackmail operation, but look at all these unwieldy connections we can kind of posit. Let's throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks, and then put the burden on me, Michael Tracey, to explain it, rather than you having to come up with any intelligible thesis that supposedly logically leads to what you clearly have some bizarre psychic need to want to believe, which is that there was, in fact, this massive pedophilic sex trafficking operation that entrapped legions of prominent people and now somehow like dictates how our societies are organized or governed. So there are some parallels here in terms of like the public resonance of how these issues exist.
And how it's presented. And if Jason can play a video for me, I brought a clip, Michael, and I brought a clip because you just debated somebody who is in this clip, and it is from the show done by my friend Andrew Schultz, who I love, and this is no criticism of him, but I thought this was interesting. They posted this and said, if you don't believe that there's a conspiracy, there isn't a conspiracy, watch this. And I just thought this was an interesting 1 minute.
Where was this posted?
On Instagram, and this is an interesting 1 minute clip with ominous music that shows you kind of how this stuff is presented. If we can play that.
2002.
Yes.
Very important year in the Epstein story. 2002 is when journalist Vicky Ward, she works here in New York City, Vanity Fair magazine.
This is the Vanity Fair article.
This is the very first premier magazine to say, who is this guy?
Yes.
Graydon Carter, the legendary Condé Nast editor, king of New York society, basically works with Vicky and says, hey, let's go write about this Epstein figure. Vicky eventually uncovers evidence of the young women trafficking, of the intelligence community ties, and all of this in 2002. According to Carter, somebody put a bullet, I think it was either outside of his house or wherever he was, and a dead cat to intimidate him while he is investigating the Epstein story. Any mention of his intelligence ties, which he's confronted with directly, of the sex trafficking and the pedophilia accusations, and all of it is dropped from the Vanity Fair article. It shows his power to shut down Graydon fucking Carter, his power to bring the Condé Nast empire to bear.
Well, a couple of things about this. I thought that was an interesting way of presenting something.
The music is just,
the music's good.
It's like a Twilight Zone score.
I will say a few things about this and then throw it over to you, Michael. Is if you've worked in magazines, the people who usually shut you down are the lawyers, because things aren't well sourced. And I've actually been through this when I was at Newsweek. So that's not that mysterious. But you just notice here a few fudging of timelines. There was no intelligence connections that were in the original draft of Vicky Ward's article that was submitted to Vanity Fair in 2002. Vicky Ward also, wrote this hagiography of Ghislaine Maxwell like 10 years later. I mean, this was not somebody who
did she? I haven't seen that.
Oh yeah, I'll send you that one. That one's, she says like, there's no more fascinating person in New York. And I think that came out in 2011. But all of the timeline stuff, even, Graydon Carter says, I found a dead cat and a bullet. In both of those were not, they did not
a horse
happen.
in her bed, in his bed.
Yeah.
Horse's head, severed horse head rather.
And that did not happen when that story was being reported. It happened many years later. So they're just
actually no. Explain. I haven't looked into that. I've heard that allegation that Graydon Carter had a dead cat at his show up at his apartment or something. But explain to me the chronology on that. I'm not even 100%.
Well,
sure.
I think that was in 2006 or 7.
Okay.
And it was not around the time. And he talks about it in his recent memoir, in which he defends himself against the charge that they killed this story because Jeffrey Epstein showed up at the office and he was so powerful that he could actually tame Graydon Carter. There's a lot of things that he says there, some of which aren't true, because the intelligence stuff, Vicky Ward is the only person to have ever made that claim, and she made it in 2019, almost 20 years later. So that's these little sleights of hand where it creates a story that's like makes you scratch your chin, but there's nothing in that. It's sort of empty calories, because it says he's so powerful that he got this article shut down, and Graydon Carter says, well, no, we just didn't have the goods, and we couldn't go forward with it because we'd end up in court. And there's a quote in the New Yorker with Isaac Chotiner, who said that he interviewed Vicky Ward, and she has since claimed that they were trying to kill these stories for that reason. And Isaac Chotiner says this is all contradicted by her own emails, and she's very, very sparing with the truth. And so all of these people have credibility problems.
Yeah.
And it's just a story that, from a journalistic point of view, we're supposed to be skeptical of things. We are supposed to go after these things. You'd think.
Apparently not.
I know it's more fun that there's an enormous trafficking conspiracy involving kings and princes and famous people, but that has never been established. And because of how we talk about this stuff and how it's talked about online and in podcasts, this is presumed to be true. So that clip, I thought, when you said how this Russiagate information was kind of put out into the ether, and just by implication, you started thinking that Donald Trump was on the FSB payroll. But I want to get to Rebecca, who is in the audience and has her hand up. And she had her hand up early, which means I think that she's probably angry at us.
Can I just quickly address what you just said before we go to Rebecca, or do we have to go to Rebecca right now?
Oh, no, address it. And then
okay, I do want to get to Rebecca.
Rebecca's going to limber up for a second.
Okay, yes. Not that it particularly matters, but my memory is, and then I just double checked, that the first major magazine profile that came out on Epstein was in New York Magazine in 2002. the Vanity Fair piece by Vicky Ward appears to have come out in 2003. Not that that's like a hugely consequential fact, but it seems to have been potentially misstated there by Sagar. I'm sure he would correct it if you could provide him with the evidence.
I do think he's an honest broker. I don't mean to.
I agree. He has corrected himself on a few occasions with respect to this story.
I like him too. Like, not personally. I don't know him personally.
So I'm not trying to impugn anyone personally.
I think he's a decent guy.
But I do find that over and over again, factual statements are fudged and imputed with certain sinister overtones, and people feel like they have really no obligation to maintain studiously tethered to any factual record, so they'll just blatantly say stuff. And journalistic veracity has been a huge victim, if we want to talk about victims, of this whole saga. I just listened to, because people have been imploring me to, although I had been avoiding it, there was this hour-long discussion between Chris Hedges and Nick Bryant that has over like 1.5 million views on YouTube right now. Nick Bryant was the guy who obtained the original, or an original copy of the so-called Epstein Little Black Book, and ended up working with Gawker to get it published in January of 2015. And the guy, it's unbelievable. Almost every other sentence, he says something that's either a gigantic distortion, an egregious misrepresentation, or just factually, indisputably, provably false, over and over and over again. I'll just give you one quick example. On this Chris Hedges video, which people might have seen because it has over 1.5 million views, he claims that one of the conditions of the so-called Epstein Victims Compensation Program, which was set up after Epstein's death in 2019 by both victim attorneys, or quote-unquote alleged victim attorneys, David Boies and Bradley Edwards et al., and then lawyers for Epstein's estate. They set up this program where self-identified victims could receive up to $5 million through a confidential and non-adversarial mediation process. And many did receive many millions from that fund. But Nick Bryant says that one of the conditions that a woman had to agree to in order to receive a payout from this fund was that they had to sign a non-disclosure agreement that forbade them from ever naming any other perpetrator. So this, according to Bryant, is one reason why it's so incredibly obvious that this child sex trafficking ring, in which many other prominent people are implicated, has been covered up. It's just totally false what he said. I mean, it's unbelievable. You can find the documents, the court submitted and court approved protocols for how this compensation program was administered, which expressly says that there are no confidentiality requirements or non-disclosure requirements imposed on anyone who receives a settlement. They can say whatever they want. And the administrator of the program also said that anybody who receives a settlement has no barrier to naming, if they so choose, or if they have grounds to do so, some other perpetrator who was not connected to Epstein's estate, because that's who furnished the funds and provided the settlement, the kind of structure for the settlement. So, I mean, that's just one example. And yet there's just every day I see some just absolutely flagrant example of journalists, forget the general public, I mean, that's a given, but for professional journalists, people who are professionally in the media, to not perceive the slightest obligation to stay at all connected to the factual record is just staggering to me. And over again, it happens. Julie K. Brown, who was the person who wrote the Miami Herald series in 2018 that breathed new life into the Epstein saga, harnessed the power of Me Too, Brown says. Another irony, which is why it's also ironic that people on the right are so invested in the story, because it became a cultural sensation in part due to how it factored into the whole Me Too mania of that period, and the so-called norms that became commonplace in terms of believing women and so forth. Vicky Ward, whose book Julie K. Brown, whose book I read, published 2021. She extensively quotes and cites. People can go to my site, mtracy.net, read the piece on this if they want. She extensively quotes from, references, and even concocts new quotations based on the unpublished memoir manuscript of Virginia Giuffre, The Proven Fabulist. And Julie K. Brown just presents this to the readers of the book as though it's a verified, vetted, factual recitation of events. And even Gouffre's own lawyers, 2 years before Brown published her book, acknowledged in a court filing that this unpublished memoir manuscript represented a, quote, fictionalized account of what Gouffre purportedly experienced, and Brown makes no mention of it. And that's just one other example of the unbelievable journalistic deficiencies that have been attendant to this story that nobody points out because they'd rather just join the hysteria.
Let's get to Rebecca now, who's been very patiently waiting. I hope to yell at us. I'll bring a little fire. Rebecca, you got a question? Did we lose Rebecca? No, Rebecca's there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yep. We can hear you.
No, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. All I got to say is thank you. Y'all are talking sensible. It's crazy because I'm hearing 1,000 girls. I'm hearing 500 girls. You know, they went from one state to the other state and all of this. And it just, the evidence is just not there.
Mm-hmm.
That
Rebecca, I wanted
to.
Yeah, I want to hone in on that because that was a story that made the Drudge report that there was thousands of girls. And it was a very curious thing because the sentence from the government, the preceding clause, said as pertained to previous releases, as if they had said this before. And I said, that must be a typo because they're saying previously we've said thousands of victims when they hadn't. So something didn't add up about that. And I thought, you know, what is often categorized as a conspiracy is oftentimes a mistake. That seemed to me like it was probably a mistake. But then, of course, that breathes more life into certain precincts of this conspiracy.
And then, yeah. Rebecca, thank you for raising that because that's an excellent point. The claim that there were, quote, over 1,000 victims that's an assertion in the DOJ FBI memo from the Sunday of 4th of July weekend that instigated this whole controversy that we're still living with. And it's a bizarre claim. They don't really specify who would constitute a victim. They seem to conflate Epstein's purported possession of what they call commercial pornography, which would be legal, meaning you could possess commercial pornography, which by virtue of it being commercial pornography would only depict persons who are over 18. And it seems to conflate that with potential child exploitation material. So it's not even clear at all who the DOJ and FBI are asserting are these over 1,000 victims. But this has become part of now the popular lore because it is bizarre that if the government is claiming that there are legitimately over 1,000 victims, that there would be no further prosecutorial action to take, because what does the public immediately assume when they hear that figure? Over 1,000 child sex trafficking victims. And that's not what the government says. I'm not sure if it was a mistake or not, but presumably the wording of that memo was carefully considered on some level. And I take from it to be a deliberate conflation because they were seeking to sort of insulate themselves from scrutiny for not potentially pursuing any further prosecution, but also setting out to like emphasize the supposed gravity of Epstein's crimes or whatever by throwing out this nice round number that seems really disturbing to the average person, but is not based on any body of credible evidence that I can see, and probably as a result of many conflations. One of those conflations is the tendency on the part of the media and lawyers to just use the generic term victim, Epstein victim, to describe anybody who has made any claim whatsoever against Epstein, which includes a significant number of adult women, meaning women in their 20s, early 20s, mid 20s, whatever, who subsequently, in order to become eligible for settlement funding or whatever their motivation, started to claim that they had in fact been trafficked. So one example is this woman, Shantae Davies, who actually Nick Bryant, in his original piece on this for Gawker in January of 2015, cites as a potential victim, but she gives Bryant a reply on the record by email for that January 2015 article and denies and almost acts aghast that she could be called a victim because she had some previous relationship potentially with Epstein. And this same woman who, starred in, like, let's say softcore porn type productions also, and was an adult who was in her 20s, 21 or 22 when she first encountered Ghislaine, Maxwell, and Epstein. She then later, of course, came out and said that she was a victim. She had been trafficked. She had been sexually assaulted, abused, etc. And then, if you claim that and the settlement floodgates have opened, that makes you eligible for up to millions of dollars. So I don't know if I could maybe come up with some claim that I had been sex trafficked by Jeffrey Epstein 15 or 20 years ago, even if it might not be a totally accurate representation of the real truth. Maybe I would be motivated to say whatever I could to get the several $1 million payment as well. So I'm not sure that I totally even begrudge some of these people. What I do begrudge is the relentless credulity of the media in not applying a modicum of critical detachment about almost any of this, and in so doing, fomenting a moral panic, fomenting all-consuming hysteria, and it takes and one element of that is their tendency to just say, oh, some Epstein victim said something. Gloria Allred did yet another press conference yesterday with yet another alleged Epstein victim who was presented by, like, the Associated Press in their YouTube video on this and other articles relating it, just presented generically as an Epstein victim. So what is the average person who hears just a tidbit about that or reads a headline? What do they assume? This must be yet another of the supposedly over 1,000 child sex trafficking victims. This woman was literally 27 years old when she claims in 1997 she went to a hotel room of Epstein's in Los Angeles for a Victoria's Secret lingerie tryout. And over the course of that hotel room visit, she claims Epstein groped her buttocks. Okay, maybe he groped the buttocks, maybe he didn't. I don't know, but that in no way would substantiate these child sex trafficking operations, even if we just stipulated that it did happen. And yet there's this endless conflation that occurs where people see something about a victim somewhere and it doesn't matter. None of the details about the victims are clarified, and then people just assume that this maximalist version of these Epstein-related theories must have gotten an additional piece of evidence showing that it's true.
Rebecca, I will leave us for tonight's episode and leave you with one admonition, one bit of advice. And this is something that one would expect from journalists, is just to apply a sort of basic logic to certain things. The reason you shouldn't believe that 9/11 was an inside job, because basic logic suggests that Building 7 being wired by multiple people to blow up in the middle of the night would probably not stay secret, because nothing really does. But the basic logic of this stuff, thousands of people and, a couple people come forward, it doesn't make a ton of sense. The fact that, Jeffrey Epstein had many opportunities to weaponize these videos and stuff that he had when he was arrested the first time. He was very upset about being called a sex offender. Why not deploy it then? Why not deploy it in 2019? And, you live in New York City, as I do, and people who don't say, I can't believe a camera was broken in a New York City facility. It's like, have you ever ridden the subway? Everything's broken all the time. The guy was asleep at the job. He's a prison guard in New York City at 1 a.m. Of course he's asleep at the job. All of this stuff is basic logic that is thrown out the window in favor of a more salacious conspiracy theory. And I will just say that, Michael's work is very good. You can disagree with Michael. You can get mad at him for, whatever words he chooses. But he is the person that is pointing out that you can have your theories, have your fun little theories, but there is no evidence of this stuff actually existing. And that's what we do as journalists, and that's what people do in courtrooms too, is they lean on evidence that suggests this stuff is real. And until I see that, I am not going to believe that he was a Mossad agent that was filming Bill Clinton and Ehud Barak So I don't know what. So they could blackmail. I mean, Mossad has better. I mean, they're blowing up pagers in Lebanon. I mean, do you think they're going to go to Jeffrey Epstein and say, "What do you got on these people at your island?" I don't buy it. But I want to thank Michael Tracey for coming on and giving us the skinny on all of this stuff. And, you know, it's funny because this stuff is, decades old. It's incredible to think that Jeffrey Epstein died 6 years ago, and we're still talking about it and it's still convulsing the government. And there's still new revelations, and Michael is on top of all of them. So go to his Substack. It's mtracy.net, right? You can get all that stuff.
mtracy.net, that's right. If anybody is outraged by what they would instinctively believe must be something false that I've said, almost all of it, or much of it, is substantiated with copious primary source documentation on the Substack at this point, mtracy.net, so you can go take a look at it for yourself, and then DM me or email me if you need additional evidentiary corroboration for something that I've said here.
And come back with us on the Moynihan Report on Tuesday. We'll be back in the studio. We didn't want to feel like being in the studio. Long story, but we're building another one too. So we have a big new studio sometime soon. And go to the YouTube channel and subscribe. All the things that people say at the end of podcasts. Go do all of that, and we will see you on Tuesday with a new episode and another phenomenal guest. Bye. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Rebecca was, she came out of left field with her question. I would have expected something much more